about the kind of evolution of the war in Ukraine, which is still going on, by the way. It's fairly static, but they're shelling pretty much every week, and there are still casualties being inflicted on civilians and on combatants on both sides fairly regularly, which made this film, I think, a really important thing, because as was noted by Lucy at the end of that, at the end of the film, it has kind of fallen off the news agenda, and those of us who work in newsrooms know how difficult it is to interest editors in a grinding war that's been going on for a very long time. In terms of its intensity, it's very much overshadowed by things like Syria, so I think this is a very valuable contribution. I wanted to start with Albina because you produced it and basically came with the idea. The interesting thing about this film, one thing that I took away, is that unlike many films about war, it's not about, what cameramen call the bang bang. It's not about two sides fighting. It's kind of about war as almost as a natural phenomenon, a disaster that happens to ordinary people over which they're basically powerless, which we perhaps don't see that much of. So tell us how this film came about.
Well, originally we had an idea. In fact, it was kind of collaborative with Lucy the whole time, but we had this idea to make a film about the volunteer movement in Ukraine, because it's amazing, but because the country's broken down and there's so much corruption, there's so little money to rebuild or do anything, help people. It's really volunteers like Oleg, but and people from Kiev who have nice lives, who go out there and they work with people, and it's incredible. But our editors actually said, what was kind of bit murky, why don't you sort of find focus? And then we found this bakery, which is a newly founded bakery in this town. And I think, for me personally, it was good to tell a positive story about a conflict, because I think we're so used to these awful images of destruction and poor children and people being gassed, and there's always kind of a shadow of one side, that's sort of the aggressor. And it was, I think, really good to tell a story, about people's lives, and a hero or a bunch of heroes who, despite all these circumstances, are actually trying to, they're persevering, they're laughing. Some of them, these women who live in these little shacks, and they've lost their relatives, they somehow joke and they get through the day and they're positive. And so, I think, to try and keep the focus on what's going on there, it was really important to find a kind of positive story that people would be interested to watch, and not just kind of go, oh yeah, another conflict, another sort of bunch of deaths, destruction and hopelessness.
Yeah, I think sometimes we thought, is this a bit artificial? Are we providing this artificial sliver of comfort? But it's so tempting for people to just turn off the TV when they hear yet another. It just becomes a bit meaningless, the numbers that have been killed, the number. Just a few days ago, a man aged 60 was trying to cross the border post at Marinka, and he died of a heart attack. There are all these little tragedies all the time that happen to ordinary people, and the challenge is to make people care about it. Like, why do we care anymore? And that was one reason. And also, I thought the sort of entrepreneurial spirit of the bakery was kind of encouraging, to see sort of that people still have to eat, they still have to buy their vegetables, and how do people survive? It's kind of quite an important point.
Can everybody hear us? So fine, this is working. Brilliant. Brilliant, thanks for that. So I just wanted to ask about your so just to give a bit of background to these. So Albina, you've kind of reported and been in and out of the war in the Donbass kind of since the beginning. Lucy, was this your first reporting right there?
This is the first time I've ever even been to eastern Ukraine, because quite soon after the takeover of Crimea, I was there to make a film about what had happened, what did Russia's sort of holiday paradise look like 4 months after the takeover? Who was going on holiday there and why? Because for a lot of Russians, Crimea is really, really central. A lot of people went there on holiday camp. They've got memories of their first kiss there. They've got all kinds of very, very happy. It's very emotional. That's one of the reasons that Putin got so much kind of adulation from a lot of ordinary Russians. For bringing back Crimea, but it sort of gradually emerged when I was talking to people, that quite a few that had said, oh, we're really happy to be here, we didn't really want to go to Crete this year, Goa can wait, you know, we really want to go to Crimea. And it emerged that they'd actually been sometimes quite strong-armed into going on holiday there by their company or by, you know, some sort of organisation that had some sort of measure of control over them in Russia. But I mean, I really wanted to understand like what Crimea meant to the Russian, you know, in the Russian psyche, I suppose. But while I was there, so this was like June 2014, the first wave of refugees came from eastern Ukraine, and they were sort of pouring into some like holiday camps where there was a lot of space to spread out mattresses, and they were coming these absolutely horrendous stories of what happened to them, you know, how families had been split up, and one woman said, I've got nothing but this rucksack, and then I tried to give her some money and she just like burst into tears, and she said, this is so humiliating, I could never imagine this would happen to me. So I kept that in my head a long time, but I didn't go to the war in the whole time until now. And so I was very, very struck by not just the gaping holes in the masonry and all that, but just by the quiet, the emptiness, the fact that, you know, after 4 o'clock, you know, they say like you can't see a cat outside. It's really quite spooky. I mean, you know, I don't tend to go to hot wars. I tend to go to wars when it's kind of calmed down a bit and sort of when it's dropped out of the headlines. I wouldn't sort of present myself as a war reporter at all. But so all these things really stuck in my head. But like Albina says, the fortitude of some of the people, the way they can crack jokes, the way that, you know, they're worrying about whether we've had enough to eat, you know, when we've just come from London. You know, the way they kind of kept on, she was trying to give me all these jars of pickled cabbage from her cellar. And I was saying, no, like, come on, Olya, you need this food to get through the winter. And I don't know, there's something about them that was so inspiring in a way. And I don't mean to be sentimental about it, because, you know, it's not it's a very ugly situation. But, yeah, anyway.
Before we come to Anna, I just wanted to ask you, kind of contrasting, you've been in and out of eastern Ukraine since the beginning of the war in 2014, kind of saw it break out. So, could you give us a sense of how you feel it's changed, or what you saw on this assignment, or whether you think it's pretty much the same as you left it, or how the people there how the impact of the war has played out over the years? It's now 4 years, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, this has definitely been the quietest time that I was there, you know, throughout the war. There was, like, I was there during the really, like, the heavy battles, and it was really frightening, and this was pretty quiet. There was a bit of shelling that we heard here and there, but it was basically like the kind of day-to-day drudgery of living in this war zone with no end in sight, and just all the other problems that come with it, which is like lack of employment and lack of really long-term solutions and lack of, you know, pensions, and the division between families, and, you know, just a kind of general depression, and you know, what do you do with your children? So I mean, I think we saw, like, and we met some families that have come back because the height of the fighting is, you know, subsided. So some people who tried to make another life for themselves in another part of the country felt that they can't, or because they had a house there, because they had an old person to look after, so they've returned. Because it's really difficult for people from East Ukraine, even if they're on the officially Ukrainian side, to go to another part of the country, because they're stigmatized, because they have this strong accent, because a lot of them don't speak Ukrainian, so they can't actually, and plus the country is actually really depressed economically. There's like no jobs. It's really difficult for them to move somewhere else. So I mean, I guess that's the difference in the fact that it's just unresolvable. I mean, the biggest difference, of course, is also the fact that I've reported mostly from, well, a lot of the time I was in Donetsk, and the territory which is called DNR, which is the rebel-held territory. And of course, now the BBC is not allowed to go there, and most Western organizations are not allowed to go there. And of course, as you know, this is what we wanted to do to show a more complete picture.
What I really like about this panel is we have two journalists, very good journalists, and can I call you a historian? Is that what you want?
You can call me a political scientist.
Okay. The political scientist. I mean, I would call you a historian, to be honest, because simply because there is, of course, it's a kind of self-indulgent trope that we journalists trot out about writing the first draft of history. The thing about drafts is that they're always wrong and they need rewriting. So you generally find go there, do all this stuff on the surface and so on. I personally find quite often when I've reported something, I look back a few years later and go, I had no idea what was going on, did I? Academics come in and they sift through everything, and then you start to get stuff. And your book is about kind of the other side of the lines in a way. You've written a book which is about kind of from the roots up, kind of how this uprising occurred, and kind of parking the issue of Russia's involvement, which has been talked about a lot. And interesting things, you talk a lot about kind of, I mean, I kind of felt like ordinary people, quite like the people we saw in this. So I was wondering if you could kind of tell us, I mean, in your view, how, the Donbass people there, how did ordinary people get sucked into this war? How did it come about? And I was also wondering if you have any kind of anecdotes similar to these people's lives that came across in your research.
Absolutely, it is impossible to summarize a book in without 5 minutes presentation. But just to mention before I kind of talk about that, about significance of bread, because when I was asking people, basic questions among all this chaos and disorder, how many people you think live in your town or in your village or in your city? The local authorities, local mayors would use bread as an indicator. That's how much bread is being baked, and that's how much bread is being consumed, and therefore we estimate that so many people must be living there, because that's such a kind of basic human life indicator, which kind of encompasses it's all. Bread is kind of life itself. So in that sense, your film, I think, is very telling. My kind of the reason why I wanted to write this book, because I felt that the perspective of what it is this rebel territories are and what they are like was kind of missing in our discourse, because I do not come into this as a Ukraine specialist. I'm not. I'm a conflict scientist. I worked and wrote about other conflicts in former Soviet Union, but also further afield. So for me, it is about what is the experience of people in conflict, and also people who actually move and shake, people who move the history of conflict to another level. How they escalate it, what drives them, why they choose to participate in action which can cost them life and limb, and where material rewards are non-existent or not really obvious. So that's kind of where I come in. What I first say, it is not a Putin book, because we already have a lot of books about geopolitics, about international dimensions of the conflict. And secondly, I cannot really tell you what President Putin really thinks. There are so many other people who tell the world what goes through the head of Russian president. But I could get access and kind of being a bit closer to direct conflict participants, ordinary people who decided for different reasons to participate in the rebellion, people who came from Russia, people who came from other parts of former Soviet Union, and further afield. What the term which got this notoriety because of IS, foreign fighters. But I interviewed somebody, for instance, who came from Chile and who was sitting with the people in Lugansk. And they were both thinking that they have enough in stake that they were prepared to give their life for each other. So I was interested what was driving them, how it came about, what were the ideas, and also what were the emotions, which kind of gelled it together. Because when I was doing this research, 2014, really very odd mismatch. You have people who are kind of very much in a position to Russian leadership, to President Putin, to the whole thing which came about in Russia, oligarchic capitalism. So Donbass was this land of utopia to build a society which kind of failed in Russia. So, and that also had traction with the local field commanders in the narrative, in the words of Alexei Moscovoy, one of the field commanders. That's our only chance to build a humane and fair society. Yeah, so kind of very much that promise. Yeah. Okay, yeah, it didn't materialize.
Can I just kind of clarify? So, what's interesting to me is that, I mean, what we saw in the film was like the immense human cost and economic cost of war. This complete destruction of your ordinary life, of your economic possibilities, and so on. Despite, if we put aside all of the outside influences, which we all know were there, nonetheless, people opted to do this, and somehow this war erupted in the Donbass. Do you have a story? I don't know, maybe a local fighter you interviewed that kind of explains why you think people took up arms and how this war kind of.
Okay, people who are in some kind of leadership roles, they fight for what they believe are kind of grand ideas. Russian world, Russian spring. Most of people who actually participate in armed action and sometimes inflict and sustain horrendous casualties actually do it for something which is much closer to heart. My town, my village has been attacked. They bombarded us. They used ballistic missiles against civilian areas. My mates died. These territorial battalions have done something. It doesn't mean that they have personally witnessed some atrocities, but for them the experience of kind of thinking about it and internalizing them is real. So people talked about things which I knew could not have witnessed personally, as if it was personal lived in experience. So then you have that logic of kill or be killed. If we do not strike, they will kill us. Odessa, that's kind of, in that narrative, Marty hoofed on the innocence, 48 people died, what started as a peaceful protest. So that created the effect that you have indignation, you have solidarity, but you also have a sense of opportunity, kind of now or never. This is your only chance in life. And I would also say the other thing is excitement. For many people, participating in rebellion was kind of liberating act, which created an agency. Just acting already was an empowering experience. I have lived a very high life. So just you wanted anecdote, tell you, but it starts with a person. Most people were not fighting under their real names, at least at first. So they will be fighting out at their radio call signs. So if you're in the regular army, you will be given some kind of number as your call sign. But there was not an army. There were all sorts of field commanders with their own kind of squads. So you call yourself something.
A nickname, basically.
Yes.
A nickname on the radio.
And but you become that person. You call yourself Batman. And you grow yourself into Batman roles. Then it actually is successful beyond your wildest dreams. So you set up your battalion called Batman. So you all have all this calling of other kind of Batman. Then battalion called Avenging Ghost, Prison. Again, it's a story about something. So everybody gets this collective identity. We are this Avenging Ghosts. We are here, but also not here. It is a bit of a mirage, but we created it, and that gives us the sense of agency. We act.
Sure. So so that's very interesting to me. Just as someone who's covered it, I saw that myself a lot, like young men especially, but also kind of middle-aged guys, right, who found, picking up a Kalashnikov, joining a group, you could see this kind of excitement and purpose, and perhaps that had something to do with, kind of the economic desperation and depression over many years and things like that.
Well, wanted to be a hero.
What I really like about this panel is we have two journalists, very good journalists, and can I call you a historian? Is that what you want?
You can call me a political scientist.
Okay. A political scientist. I mean, I would call you a historian, to be honest, because simply because there is, of course, it's a kind of self-indulgent trope that we journalists drop out about writing the first draft of history. The thing about drafts is that they're always wrong and they need rewriting. So you generally find go there, do all this stuff on the surface and so on. I personally find quite often when I've reported something, I look back a few years later and go, I had no idea what was going on, did I? Academics come in and they sift through everything, and then you start to get stuff. And your book is about kind of the other side of the lines in a way. You've written a book which is about kind of from the roots up, kind of how this uprising occurred, and kind of parking the issue of Russia's involvement, which has been talked about a lot. And interesting things, you talk a lot about kind of, I kind of felt like ordinary people, quite like the people we saw in this. So I was wondering if you could kind of tell us, in your view, how, the Donbass people there, how did ordinary people get sucked into this war? How did it come about? And I was also wondering if you have any kind of anecdotes kind of similar to these people's lives that came across in your research.
Absolutely, it is impossible to summarize a book in with a 5 minutes presentation, but just to mention before I kind of talk about that, about significance of bread, because when I was asking people, basic questions among all this chaos and disorder, how many people you think live in your town, or in your village, or in your city? Kind of the local authorities, local mayors would use bread as an indicator. That's how much bread is being baked, and that's how much bread is being consumed, and therefore we estimate that so many people must be living there, because that's such a kind of basic human life indicator, which kind of encompasses it all. Bread is kind of life itself. So in that sense, your film, I think, is very telling. The reason why I wanted to write this book, because I felt that the perspective of what it is this rebel territories are and what they are like was kind of missing in our discourse, because I do not come into this as a Ukraine specialist. I'm not. I'm a conflict scientist. I worked and wrote about other conflicts in former Soviet Union, but also further afield. So for me, it is about what is the experience of people in conflict, and also people who actually move and shake, people who moved the history of conflict to another level, how they escalated, what drives them, why they choose to participate in action which can cost them life and limb, and where material rewards are non-existent or not really obvious. So that's kind of where I come in. What I first say, it is not a Putin book, because we already have a lot of books about geopolitics, about international dimensions of the conflict. And secondly, I cannot really tell you what President Putin really thinks. There are so many other people who tell the world what goes through the head of Russian president. But I could get access and kind of being a bit closer to direct conflict participants, ordinary people who decided for different reasons to participate in the rebellion, people who came from Russia, people who came from other parts of former Soviet Union, and further afield. What the term which got this notoriety because of IS, foreign fighters, but I interviewed somebody, for instance, who came from Chile and who was sitting with the people in Lugansk. and they were both thinking that they have enough in stake that they were prepared to give their life for each other. So I was interested what was driving them, how it came about, what were the ideas, and also what were the emotions, which kind of gelled it together. Because when I was doing this research, 2014, really very odd mismatch. You have people who are kind of very much in a position to Russian leadership, to President Putin, to the whole thing which came about in Russia, oligarchic capitalism. So Donbass was this land of utopia to build a society which kind of failed in Russia. So, and that also had traction with the local field commanders in the narrative, in the words of Alexei Moscovoy, one of the field commanders. That's our only chance to build a humane and fair society. So kind of very much that promise. Okay, it didn't materialize.
Can I just kind of clarify? So what's interesting to me is, I mean, what we saw in the film was like the immense human cost and economic cost of war, this complete destruction of your ordinary life, of your economic possibilities and so on. Despite, if we put aside all of the outside influences, which we all know were there, nonetheless, people opted to do this, and somehow this war erupted in Donbass. Do you have a story? I don't know, maybe a local fighter you interviewed that kind of explains why you think people took up arms and how this war kind of.
Okay, people who are in some kind of leadership roles, they fight for what they believe are kind of grand ideas. Russian world, Russian spring. Most of people who actually participate in armed action and sometimes inflict and sustain horrendous casualties actually do it for something which is much closer to heart. My town, my village has been attacked. They bombarded us. They used ballistic missiles against civilian areas. My mates died. These territorial battalions have done something. It doesn't mean that they have personally witnessed some atrocities, but for them the experience of kind of thinking about it and internalizing them is real. So people talked about things which I knew could not have witnessed personally, as if it was personal lived in experience. So then you have that logic of kill or be killed. If we do not strike, they will kill us. Odessa, that's kind of in that narrative, Marty hoofed on the innocence, 48 people died, what started as a peaceful protest. So that created the effect that you have indignation, you have solidarity, but you also have a sense of opportunity, kind of now or never. This is your only chance in life. And I would also say the other thing is excitement. For many people, participating in rebellion was kind of liberating act, which created an agency. Just acting already was an empowering experience. I have lived a very high life. So just you wanted anecdote, tell you. Well, it starts with a person. Most people were not fighting under their real names, at least at first. So they will be fighting out at their radio call signs. So if you're in the regular army, you will be given some kind of number as your call sign. But there was not an army. There were all sorts of field commanders with their own kind of squads. So you call yourself something.
A nickname, basically.
Yes.
A nickname on the radio.
And but you become that person. You call yourself Batman. And you grow yourself into Batman roles. Then it actually is successful beyond your wildest dreams. So you set up your battalion called Batman. So you all have all this calling of other kind of Batman. Then battalion called Avenging Ghost, Prison. Again, it's a story about something. So everybody has this collective identity. We are this Avenging Ghosts. We are here, but also not here. It is a bit of a mirage. but we created it, and that gives us the sense of agency. We act.
Sure. So that's very interesting to me. As someone who's covered it, I saw that myself a lot, like young men especially, but also kind of middle-aged guys, right, who found, picking up a Kalashnikov, joining a group, you could see this kind of excitement and purpose, and perhaps that had something to do with, kind of the economic desperation and depression over many years and things like that.
Wanting
Possibly.
to be a hero.
So is it a mainly male thing? That's
No, it's not, because I wanted to write a chapter about women in conflict, because what struck me about Ukraine in general, actually much greater sense of gender equality that we give the country and people credit for. Because when I was working there, we had all the experts who were coming to Ukraine to lecture about gender equality, and I would say no. That's actually, war experience showed that women participated in armed actions, including in commanding roles, completely equal. Husband and wife joined rebel ranks together. She actually turned out to be more capable than him, so she progressed through ranks. She became some kind of commander, and he's a rank and file fighter. I asked, how other kind of people react, and they say, I don't understand the question. What is it you're asking? If she's good,
So the kind of meritocracy. I'm just going to put that to you guys, because the film's largely about women. I mean, the guy who's leading us through is a pastor who's set this thing up, but it's mostly women on the front line, civilian women, older women largely, who kind of bear the brunt of this. What was your impression of how how the war has it disproportionately impacted women, or have the men simply left America largely in fighting age men?
Well, yeah, I mean, quite a lot of them have been killed. Quite a lot of them, if they were going to get drafted up to fight, they've been sent away to get them away from the war. But yes, quite often the women have to stay behind and look after the elderly relatives. Actually, Albina and I went to see a reading of a play written by Natalia Varbic, who's this amazing Ukrainian playwright, called Sasha Take the Trash Out. And it was about a woman and her daughter and her husband, who is a Ukrainian army officer, but he's dead, but he was still sitting at the table with them. So it's kind of dark, absurdist thing. But it was quite a lot. Like, their job was, especially the mum, war's coming, I have to organise a stove, I have to chop wood, I have to dig a well because there's no water or gas. And he was there, sort of trying to say, I need to defend the fatherland. Let me defend you. And they were going, no, you're dead. You just go rest. we don't want you around. We can deal with it. He said, but have you got visas? Have you got petrol for the car? Like, don't worry about it.
It wasn't really, I mean, what I kind of liked about the film is that you kind of parked the whole, Russian versus Ukrainian, what's going on, who's right and wrong, things like that kind of story. You looked at kind of how the war is impacting ordinary civilians. However, I'm kind of interested in bringing this question up because something that's always struck me from the very beginning of this conflict is how for a lot of people, I think for a lot of people, ordinary people in Donbass, it kind of erupted, and even if they were perhaps sympathetic to one side or another, at some point a lot of people find themselves going, where the hell did that come from? If you were living in, I don't know, in Ukraine or Russia, like even in 2012, like 2 years before, the idea of a war between Russians and Ukrainians is just, you'd be laughed out of town. So I'm quite interested in, I'll start on this side and go that way.
Wait, which side?
Okay. Your side, but journalists, then we'll get the deeper academic explanation perhaps. But what's your personal impressions about that and where it came from? And but more importantly, the subjects, the people you spoke to, how did they cope with that or explain what's happened?
Well, I mean, if you're talking about the divisions, is that what you're asking about? The divisions between the two sides?
Well, yeah, I mean, how does this incredibly vicious war erupt between, two nations that were basically, brotherly, as it were?
I mean, that's a kind of wider theme. I mean, I
In
know
Donbass.
in Donbass. No, I understand. Well, I think the main issue with Donbass is that it has always been an area which has been very poor, very problematic, quite criminal, quite disease-stricken. Well, not always, but in recent times, and also Russian-speaking. And when Maidan was going on, and there was all this debate about what Ukraine wanted and identity, I think the people of Donbass really didn't understand, because first of all they didn't speak Ukrainian, and also they weren't really included in the debate, and the leadership of Ukraine and the people of Maidan didn't really make an effort to include them. So I think first of all there was a kind of a misunderstanding, and the people there a lot of them were watching Russian television, so they were watching what the Russian kind of channels were saying about it all, which was very dismissive and saying that these people have come to do an illegal overthrow of power. But I mean, I just want to talk a little bit about the sides, because I know it's not exactly your question, but I think the people that I've met mostly on both sides of this conflict, civilians, not fighters, they're kind of mostly indifferent about politics. They're so focused on survival, and this is even an issue before the war. They're really not well-off people. They're really not kind of. The main thing is to have a stable job and somewhere to live and a future for the kids. And now that this has all been thrown out of the window because of the complications and because families have been divided, that's the main concern. But the fact that these people are now in de facto Ukraine, the people we saw, does not mean that they support Ukraine. Does not mean that they support the government. It's like incidental that they are in Ukraine. They could have been on the other side. It just happens to be where their house is and where they can get access to their pensions or whatever. So I think that's the main thing for me about this conflict, that I think the media often portrays it still as like, it's very divided. Here's one side, and people who are in DNR support the DNR, and they've chosen to be there. It's like they've got nowhere to go, a lot of them. So I think do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, Tanya, one of the bakers, was saying about the referendum. I mean, she sort of was intimating that, maybe when there was this referendum, which was in March, was it? May 2014. Do you want to remain in Ukraine or become independent constituent republic? I think that there was a lot of, I hate to say that it was like Brexit, but there was a similar kind of, probably on some parts of the population, of feeling like they were sick of all the corruption going on in the capital. People didn't understand them. People didn't give a damn about them. I mean, it's the source of a lot of Ukraine's wealth because it's an industrial area, but a lot of ordinary working people are very poor, or just getting by. And I think that they didn't really understand at all the implications of what this referendum meant. Like, very few people understood. It seemed so inconceivable, as Rana said, that Ukraine and Russia could go to war. I mean, I lived in Moscow in the early 90s. I was there during the breakup of the Soviet Union, and I remember my first trip on the train from Moscow to Lviv in western Ukraine, and everybody in the train was talking about, they've stopped the train, what's going on? They're putting up a customs post. It just seems so ridiculous. You just couldn't imagine two separate countries, and then there were two separate countries you couldn't imagine they'd go to war, that brother would fight brother. So this referendum, and then I said, so did you vote to be in did you vote against being in Ukraine in the referendum? And she said, no, in our family we didn't vote. But I'm not really quite sure whether she did vote or she didn't vote, but I got, you get a sense that there was a lot of frustration with everybody talks about the amount of corruption in Ukraine. A film that I made earlier with Albina about HIV in Ukraine, there was the most staggering amount of corruption in the Ministry of Health, huge cuts being taken by government officers on imported syringes. It was really, really bad. So, I could understand the anger that a lot of people felt, but to know what it actually meant, is another thing.
I think there's I just want to add, I think there's a real kind of fear on both sides. Like, I know some people in Kiev who, who haven't been to that part, but now there's a war, and they ask me, oh, you go there? Oh, well, I'd really like to go, but they're afraid, because they're afraid they'd go there and they'd be seen as, like, well-off Kiev person who is benefiting from this situation in some way, and they'll get eaten alive almost by people in the Donbass. So I think this is the main issue, and I don't know how to resolve this. Like, how do the two, I mean, there's more than two sides, obviously. It's a huge country and there's lots of regions. But in this conflict of more or less two sides, how do you resolve this? Even if you stop the fighting, how do you make sure that the two regions really start to hear each other and come to some sort of compromise? It's not just like, we're not going to talk to you in Russian, we're going to speak only in Ukrainian. How do they start to understand each other and go towards each other?
And from the perspective of your film, America, it just seems intractable. It doesn't seem like that's going to, well, there doesn't seem much hope on the side of the people you spoke to that could.
Well, not at the moment. I mean, but there's no end in sight of this conflict.
Well, a lot of people that we spoke to kept on saying, and I don't know what you think about this, because you've been on the other side, but a lot of ordinary people seem to say to us, well, who is this war serving? Who's benefiting from it? Who's making money out of it? And they were talking a lot about, contraband, weapons, and all sorts of dark forces at play, not just political, but sort of bandits. And how much do people talk about that in the DNR?
Well, okay, I'll answer that one, but then perhaps make a bigger point.
Yeah.
I study conflicts, so both kind of within the former Soviet Union, outside, kind of contraband smuggling, black operations, unholy alliances happen in almost every situation. Even the ISIS, who has to be, seem to be completely uncompromising, so holy jihadists, even they have been doing backhand deals, that more information now comes out, So the fact that when there is murky situation and lots of people with weapons, that happens. Yeah. So the fact that it is kind of so unusual in Ukraine is because Ukraine never had a conflict. So for them, for people, condition of peace is their default condition. War is abnormal. But if you put it the kind of continuing with other conflicts, what they experience is, what people in places like Sri Lanka have been experiencing for quite a while. Yeah. But kind of on a bigger point, one thing is that in order to create a very violent and maybe successful movement, you don't actually need to have a lot of people to start. But you need to have some kind of core determined group which is prepared to act irrespective of conflict. If we look at the history of Russian Civil War, always
about 100 years ago now.
Actually, about 1 million people participated directly in the civil war in the country of 125 million people. Yeah, so kind of putting it into perspective.